I invited him to come and speak to us again this year. The pod is called Unfinished Business. He wasn't able to leave the United States, so last week we recorded this.
I'm glad to be back with you at ideacity. As you may know, I was here some years ago, and in the intervening years, the vagaries of U.S. justice have made it practically impossible for me to go to Canada. And indeed, Moses Znaimer's effort to come and interview me when I was guest of the American people was rejected by the head of the establishment on the grounds that it was a cultural initiative that was inappropriate to the reforming and rehabilitating objectives of the Bureau of Prisons. So I'm glad that we have put that inconvenience behind us. As I recall, when I was with you the last time, approximately 6 years ago, I reflected that one of the very few advantages of the legal travails that I was going through at that time was it gave me the reason to be back in Canada after an absence of a number of years when I was often in Canada, but mainly a resident of Great Britain. And I mentioned that I was particularly impressed at the change in Canada's comparative stature in the world and the physical change in its major cities, especially in Toronto. And although I've, as I said, been absent from the country for some time, the perspective I have had from the United States does nothing but confirm that. And I wonder if I could just say a word about that to bring us up to date from where I left off with you a few years ago. Since I don't actually see the audience, I am surmising that it contains people of a variety of ages, from old-timers like myself down to quite young people. And those who are certainly my contemporaries, or somewhat younger, I think easily remember the time when Canada's policy in the world, essentially, there were departures from it, but essentially was to tug at the trouser leg of the Americans and occasionally the British, and even in the most beleaguered moments, the French. And it was an era up until approximately 10 years ago when Canada was chiefly a natural resource economy in times when the best economies were thought to be balanced economies, and those that were natural resource economies were generally disparaged in economic circles, or at least in macroeconomic circles, as hewers of wood and drawers of water. And this was facilitated as a criticism because those countries that were importers of raw materials, such as Japan, great industrial power, were able to pad around and bring on stream a surplus of anything that they needed to import, base metals, precious metals, forest products, energy, whatever. Once China and India, representing almost 40% of the world's population, became addicted to economic growth and set aside in both countries utterly insane economic policies that had been implemented for decades, the entire game changed. To have such large countries consuming such resources put an end to the era of the buyer's market in raw materials, put an end to the era when a balanced economy was the most desirable one, caused the advantageous outsourcing of a great deal of relatively simple manufacturing. And those countries that were producers of a full menu of extractive industry, certainly including Canada and Australia, became instantly the most geopolitically enviable countries in the world. We cannot in Canada take credit for our own wisdom. We can take credit for our own fortune, but we can take credit, I think, for recognizing quickly the situation and exploiting it. I think without becoming self-satisfied about it, Canadians should be well pleased at the fact that Canada came through, is coming through, it's still continuing in certain respects, the recession that began in 2008 much better than many other countries. And it is an unusual experience in Canadian history to outperform the United States so obviously and by such a wide margin. No one, I think, could have imagined that the United States, which had been so skillfully managed a country in its overall strategic policy from before the Second World War, through the period of all age short of war to the democracies, through the entry into the war and the conduct of the war by outstanding military leaders such as Marshall and Eisenhower and MacArthur and Nimitz, through the containment era to the absolute collapse of its adversary without a shot being fired in anger between the Soviet Union and the United States, that country that had achieved that and in the process had caused and led the triumph of democratic government in most of the world, would suddenly, inexplicably and unprecedentedly adopt a policy essentially of outsourcing scores of millions of jobs while admitting 15 or 20 million unskilled and underdocumented workers, well, seekers of jobs anyway, and at the same time would borrow trillions of dollars from China and Japan to buy goods that essentially the United States had been in the habit of making for itself. And at the same time, as an absolutely astounding capstone to this era, issue trillions of dollars of absolutely worthless real estate-backed securities that Wall Street, the world financial center, fed by the great business schools of America, who trained practically everybody of any economic vocation in the Western world and other parts of the world, dutifully certified as being of investment grade. This from the rating agencies which have recently put the United States itself on credit watch. Now, I'm not recounting this because I think it's news to any of you, and I'm certainly not recounting it to mock the United States. I'm only recounting it to say that even the United States, which whatever Canadian reservations about it may have been over the long relationship between the two countries, has always been what General de Gaulle described to Mackenzie King as an overwhelming contiguity. It's always been an immense presence in the life of Canada, for the most part a benign presence, and for the most part, whatever stylistic abrasions there might have been, a respected presence, justly respected. It is impossible to have much respect for this sudden shearing off of America into a world of immense self-inflicted wounds in economic and geopolitical policy. And in this context, while there is no rival to the United States as a power in the world, and I think all this talk about it being replaced by China is absolute piffle. China has made tremendous progress, and of course it's a very distinguished and large and eminent, venerable nationality. But it has many hundreds of millions of people who live essentially as they did 3,000 years ago, and they're not going to pull those people effortlessly out of where they are and maintain political composure and build institutional strength with a system that is essentially quasi-totalitarian and largely still a command economy. The United States has plenty of time to recover from its current torpor, but the fact that it is in that torpor does, relatively speaking, raise the importance of other relatively significant countries in the world, and in that number, without a question, Canada takes its place, not only as a member of G7 and G8, but for the reasons I said. Its financial institutions have functioned well, the separatist threat has effectively collapsed, it almost never runs a current account deficit, and its fiscal deficits are, in international terms, minimal. It has coherent leadership. It's restored two-party rule, although there's now an aspect of working at where the opposition is. And it is just an enviable position, a good deal more so even than when I was last with ideacity. And as I say, I'm not under the illusion I'm telling you anything you don't know, but I just want to confirm that from outside Canada, that's how it looks also. Let me say a word further about the United States. I must start by assuring you that even though it is a country that has persecuted me half to death, I maintain perspective, and it, for that has not ceased to be a great country. It is, of course, a great country. And while it has had the problems that I mentioned, and that are in any case familiar to any informed person in the world, it would be a mistake to assume that it is finished as a country, is in steep decline, or even in irreversible decline of a gradual kind. None of that is clear, and none of it need be the case. The problems are serious. They're simply not recognizing the proportions of the debt problem. And running these trillion-dollar federal budgetary deficits every year with a horizon of a decade of them, and that's on the basis of comparatively optimistic figures, while they're not really getting any job growth at all, and the unemployment rate is inching up, and the number of unemployed and chronically underemployed is approximately 20% of the workforce, which in this country is about 35 million people, more than the whole population of Canada. The consequences of all of this are not being faced, and they are very serious. And I don't know if any of you read some of the things I write, but I've had a bit of a discussion with, in the National Review Online, with some of the prominent economists in this country about how to characterize these deficits. And as far as I am concerned, a shell game is going on. The United States government can no longer sell its treasury bonds to the Chinese and other foreign buyers, which is in fact in some ways a blessing to that country. So it sells them to the Federal Reserve, the central bank of the US. The Federal Reserve pays by an electronic issuance of notes, like sending an email. So it doesn't really pay. But it doesn't exactly print money, as used to be said, but on the other hand, the deficit, the $1 trillion, actually over $1.5 trillion this year, is out there. The money goes out. It is spent, and it is a sort of confidence trick that the great American people accept that anything purporting to be currency issued by or guaranteed by the full faith and credit of these United States is valid and sound, and there is an appearance that the dollar has not declined. But in fact, in real money supply, the money supply has quadrupled, even by traditional standards of the money supply, M2. It has increased at a rate of approximately 40% a year during this Obama administration. But if you take the position I do, that the money they spend is really in addition to the money supply, if it is not balanced by revenues, then the money supply has increased by 300%. That is to say, the dollar has been devalued against a stable standard, a constant standard, by 75% in less than 3 years. This is not compatible with reserve currency or even a hard currency. And the main reason why it is not more obvious than it is, just in looking at normal indicators, is that there is, I think, an unspoken, unagreed common policy between the main currency issuers, Japan, the European Union, and the United States, that they're all doing essentially the same thing. They are all issuing, in effect, currency vastly exceeding their revenues, and they're all devaluing together. And since there is nothing resembling a gold standard, even, or silver standard, even at the level of exchanges between central banks, as there was prior to 1971, there is nothing to measure it against. They're only valued opposite each other. So if they're all inflating together, it is somewhat disguised. And I think the political class of Western Europe, the United States, and Japan are all failing to face the extreme importance of this problem. But there is going to be a reckoning. Now, the United States is what we're talking about. It's a naturally rich country. It has an extremely highly motivated and skilled population. It is patriotic, coherent, and a proud nation with a great deal to be proud about. It will come through it. All it needs is a bit of leadership. And it has had great leaders in the past, but it hasn't had them lately. And all countries have their ups and downs. So as I said earlier, I would not write it off. But in this period, Canada's relationship to the U.S. has changed, and the correlation of forces, influence, and seriousness between the two nationalities has changed significantly to the advantage of Canada from the virtually colonial status that it enjoyed even when I was a very young person, and therefore I assume within the lives of some of the people attending today. I am coming to the end of my time, so there may be some curiosity about my legal situation. I am not going to inflict it on you other than to say that the chances of my ever committing a crime are less than zero. I will, at the appropriate time, discuss in detail the vagaries of the U.S. justice system, which I referred to at the start of this rumination. And this isn't the time for that, but they promised 17 charges against me, including fantastic allegations of racketeering and money laundering. 3 were not proceeded with. 1 was dropped before it got to the jury. The jury acquitted 9, and the Supreme Court of the United States unanimously vacated the others. 2 were revived by the appellate judge to whom they were sent for him, after being excoriated by the Supreme Court, to assess the gravity of his own errors. This may be considered the juridical equivalent of reviewing and approving your own expense account. We are where we are, and I'm hopeful that it will end soon. It has been a difficult time, and I'm looking forward to coming back and being with you again physically if Moses invites me. Thank you very much. I'm not going to presume on the court. I certainly, time served is a distinct possibility, but I cannot sit here and tell you hand over heart the judge wouldn't send me back. I mean, as you know, I consider that the counts have been completely shredded, but the verdicts are there, and the legal system operates on a basis of a kind of momentum of its own. The judge in question, Judge St. Eve, is a very fair, very diligent, intelligent judge, and I would say we're hopeful, but I absolutely would not presume to predict what she will do. As I said, they had 17 charges. All 17 vanished. 2 were retrieved. I have said at every stage that I am not guilty. I think that if those 2 counts were started anew, there's no chance they would be reported out as guilty verdicts. They're just the residue of this vast prosecution they began with when they threw all the spaghetti at the wall. I think I should not be penalized for refusing to show remorse for what I strenuously claim I did not do. And I might add that amongst the other exaltations of reasoning of the prosecution is that I should be penalized even more heavily in respect of matters of which I have in fact been judged not guilty. I think that if I were to get into a detailed response to the government's antics, I would overrun the patience of your viewers, and in any case, preempt discussion that we are looking forward to in Chicago on the 24th.
Conrad, I hope you're watching. Thank you for that. Good luck on the 24th, and we look forward to having you in person here on stage next year.